He thought he had crafted the perfect life. Anthony Spencer, a man who clawed his way up the corporate ladder, stood at the pinnacle of New York society, his stunning new girlfriend, Tiffany, clinging to his arm. Tonight was his coronation, the exclusive St. Augustine charity gala. His ex-wife Maria was a distant, painful memory, a plain, simple woman he'd cast aside because she couldn't keep up. But as the grand doors of the ballroom swing open, a collective gasp silences the room. A woman of impossible elegance and poise commands the attention of every guest. And as she glides into the light, Anthony's perfectly crafted world begins to shatter. Because the woman is Maria, and the man escorting her, the man whose quiet power eclipses everyone in the room, is the one billionaire who could crush Anthony's entire existence without a second thought. The air in the back of the Maybach was thick with the scent of Tiffany's Chanel No. 5 and Anthony's own suffocating ambition. Outside, the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan's Upper East Side reflected the city lights like a scattered handful of jewels. Anthony Spencer adjusted the crisp cuffs of his Tom Ford tuxedo, the weight of his Patek Philippe watch a comforting anchor on his wrist. It was a constant reminder of how far he'd come. "Are you nervous, baby?" Tiffany Dubois purred, running a perfectly manicured, blood-red nail down the lapel of his jacket. She was a vision poured into a glittering gold Kaufman Franco gown that left little to the imagination. Her hair, a cascade of blonde extensions, had taken 4 hours at the hands of a celebrity stylist. She was in every sense of the word an asset. "Nervous? Don't be ridiculous," Anthony scoffed, though a single bead of sweat traced a path down his spine. "Tonight is a victory lap. Being personally invited to the St. Augustine Gala. This means we're in. Sterling Coal Capital is finally playing in the big leagues, and so am I." Tiffany's smile was bright but vacant. She understood status in terms of labels and followers, not the subtle, brutal power dynamics of the world Anthony was desperate to conquer. The St. Augustine Charity Gala wasn't just a party. It was the apex of the New York social food chain. It was held annually in the celestial, cavernous halls of the New York Public Library, and the guest list was a curated collection of old money, new money, and the gatekeepers who decided which was which. To be here meant you had arrived. "I can't wait to get a picture with the Vanderbilts," Tiffany whispered already, angling her phone for the perfect selfie light. "My followers will die." Anthony sighed internally. He had traded up, he reminded himself. He had shed his old skin, and with it, his old wife, Maria. Just the thought of her name was like a dull, irritating ache. Maria Reyes. She had been with him from the beginning, back when his suit was from Men's Warehouse, and their apartment in Queens had a persistent leak in the ceiling. She'd worked 2 jobs to put him through his Wharton MBA, typed his papers, and believed in him with a quiet, unwavering faith that, in hindsight, felt more like a burden than a blessing. She was plain. It was a cruel word, but the only one that fit. Not ugly, but unadorned. She wore no makeup, preferred worn-out sweaters to designer dresses, and would rather spend an evening reading dusty history books than networking. She had a degree in classics from a decent state university, a fact he once found charming, but grew to see as utterly useless. As his career at Sterling Coal Capital ascended, her simplicity became an anchor dragging him down. He needed a partner who reflected his success, a Tiffany, not a Maria. The breakup had been brutal, a calculated move on his part. He'd called her a social liability. He still remembered her face, not angry or tearful, just empty, as if he'd scooped out whatever light had been there. She hadn't fought him. She'd simply packed her books, her old sweaters, and the framed photo of them from their college graduation, and disappeared from his life. He'd heard through a mutual acquaintance that she'd moved to a small apartment downtown, working some menial job at a library or a museum. He felt a brief, fleeting pang of guilt, which he quickly smothered with the thrill of his newfound freedom. The Maybach purred to a stop in front of the library's majestic, lion-guarded entrance. A sea of flashing cameras and shouting paparazzi greeted them. Anthony stepped out, basking in the light, and smoothly helped Tiffany from the car. She posed, he smiled his arm possessively around her waist. They were the picture of modern success. Inside the scene was breathtaking. The Astor Hall was a symphony of marble gold leaf and the hushed, powerful murmur of the city's elite. Crystal glasses clinked a string quartet played Vivaldi, and the air hummed with deals being made and reputations being cemented. Anthony, good to see you, a voice boomed. It was Marcus Blackwood, a managing director from a rival firm. Bold move, bringing the arm candy. He winked at Tiffany, who preened under the attention. She's more than that, Marcus. She's the future, Mrs. Spencer, Anthony said smoothly, the lie tasting like expensive champagne. Marriage was a business contract, and he hadn't yet decided if Tiffany's assets outweighed her liabilities. For the next hour, Anthony worked the room. He shook hands with tech moguls, nodded respectfully at silver-haired titans of industry, and expertly steered Tiffany away from making any conversational blunders. He was on top of the world. This was his kingdom, his reward for shedding the dead weight of his past. He had made the right choice. He was sure of it. Then the low hum of the room shifted, a subtle change in atmospheric pressure. Conversations lulled. Heads turned towards the grand entrance. A late arrival was always a power move, and Anthony craned his neck, curious to see which billionaire had deigned to grace them with their presence. And then he saw her. The woman standing in the grand archway was not a celebrity he recognized. She was tall, poised, her dark hair swept up in an elegant chignon that highlighted the graceful line of her neck. She wore a midnight blue Schiaparelli gown, a masterpiece of understated architecture that clung to her silhouette. Around her neck was a simple yet astonishingly brilliant diamond necklace that didn't shout its worth. It whispered it a secret only the truly wealthy would understand. But it wasn't the dress or the diamonds that made Anthony's blood run cold. It was her face. Older, yes. More defined, absolutely. The soft, unassuming lines had been replaced by a quiet, devastating confidence. The eyes that once held only gentle adoration for him now surveyed the room with a calm, discerning intelligence. It was Maria. Anthony's glass of champagne slipped from his numb fingers, shattering on the marble floor, with a sound that seemed to echo the fracturing of his reality. Tiffany yelped, jumping back. But Anthony couldn't move. He could only stare. This was impossible. This couldn't be the same woman who used to wear his old university sweatshirts. This couldn't be the woman who cried when he told her she was holding him back. And then, the final fatal blow. A man stepped into the light beside her, placing a gentle, proprietary hand on the small of her back. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a bespoke suit, his presence radiating a power that made Anthony's hard-won status feel like a child's plaything. Anthony knew who he was. Everyone knew who he was. Julian Devereaux, the reclusive, enigmatic CEO of Ethelred Innovations. A man whose net worth was a subject of fevered speculation in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. A genuine titan, a kingmaker who could buy and sell sterling coal capital before his morning coffee. He didn't attend social events, ever, and he was here, with Maria, his ex-wife. The plain one. She smiled up at him, a genuine, luminous smile that Anthony hadn't seen in years, a smile he now realized had never not once been directed at him with such unfiltered joy. Julian Devereaux leaned down and whispered something in her ear. She laughed, a clear musical sound that cut through the stunned silence of the room. And in that moment, Anthony Spencer knew his victory lap was over. He was no longer a king in his castle. He was just a jester in the court of a queen he had thrown away 5 years earlier. The world wasn't marble and gold. It was plaster and linoleum. Their first apartment in Sunnyside, Queens, smelled of old pipes and Maria's perpetual baking, oatmeal cookies, her comfort food. Anthony would come home exhausted from his entry-level analyst job, and she'd be there, her brow furrowed in concentration, not over a fashion magazine, but over a translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. "How was your day?" She'd ask, her eyes clear and earnest-looking. Up from the page. "Brutal," he'd groan, dropping his briefcase. "Goldman Sachs is eating our lunch on the Bridgerton deal. You'll figure it out." She'd say, her faith in him absolute. "You always do." That faith was the fuel he ran on. Maria was his rock. When he decided to go for his MBA at Wharton, she didn't hesitate. She was working as a research assistant at the Columbia University Library, a job she loved, but that paid a pittance. Without a word, she took on a second job, waitressing on weekends at a dreary diner. "You don't have to do this, Ames," he'd said one night, watching her rub her aching feet. "Of course I do," she'd replied simply, looking at him as if the alternative was unthinkable. "This is for us, for our future." She was the architect of that future. She organized his study schedules, made flashcards for his finance exams, and proofread every single cover letter and resume he sent out. She had an uncanny knack for language, turning his clunky corporate jargon into sharp, compelling prose. When he landed the coveted internship at Sterling Coal Capital, she was more excited than he was. She celebrated by buying a $2 bottle of sparkling cider and making his favorite lasagna. He remembered her own dreams, spoken of only in quiet moments. She wanted to pursue a PhD in art history, to become a curator, to spend her life surrounded by the beauty and stories of the past. One day, she'd whisper, tracing the images in a heavy art book, "When you're settled and we're stable, I'll go back to school." Anthony had nodded and promised, "Anything you want, Ames. Once I make it, the world is yours." But making it was a moving target. The internship became a job. The analyst position became an associate. Their address changed from Queens to a respectable one-bedroom on the Upper West Side. With each promotion, Anthony changed too. The world he was entering was one of sharp suits, sharper wits, and wives who were as much a part of the corporate portfolio as the stocks they traded. He started noticing how other VPs' wives dressed, how they spoke, how they chaired charity committees, and knew exactly which fork to use. They were polished, formidable women. Then he would come home to Maria in her faded jeans and comfortable sweater, engrossed in a book about Etruscan pottery. Her quiet world, once a sanctuary, began to feel like a cage. He started making excuses. "You wouldn't enjoy this, honey. It's just a boring work thing." He went to galas and networking events alone. He told her she looked tired, suggesting she stay home. Each excuse was a small chip at the foundation of their marriage. The shame was a bitter pill. He knew he was becoming a person she wouldn't recognize, a person he himself didn't always like. But the allure of the next rung on the ladder was too strong. He started seeing her not as his partner, but as a reflection of his own humble beginnings, a past he was desperate to outrun. The final conversation happened on a Tuesday. It was clinical, bloodless. He had practiced his speech in the mirror. He sat her down in their living room, the one with the IKEA furniture they'd assembled together years ago, which now looked cheap and flimsy to his newly discerning eyes. "Maria." He began avoiding her gaze. "This isn't working." She just looked at him, her hands folded in her lap. She seemed to know it was coming. "What isn't working?" Anthony asked. "This. My life is moving in a different direction. I need someone who can move with it, someone who understands my world." "You think I don't understand it?" Her voice was quiet, dangerously so. "I helped you build it. You helped me study for exams, Maria. That's not the same thing," he said, the cruelty of his words hanging in the air. "Look at us. I'm a vice president at Sterling Coal. When I go to these events, I need a partner who can contribute, network, fit in. You're brilliant in your own way, but your way is small, small." The word was a soft puff of air, but it landed like a punch. You don't care about the right things, the right people, the right clothes, the right conversations. You're content in this dusty little world of yours. I'm not. I'm sorry, but you've become a liability. Liability. That was the word that did it. He saw something in her eyes then, not hurt, not anger, but a shutter closing, a finality. The light he had always counted on being there for him was extinguished. She stood up. I see. I'll make sure you're taken care of, he said quickly, pulling out a pre-written settlement offer. It's very generous. She didn't even look at it. I don't want your money, Anthony. She walked into the bedroom and began to pack a single suitcase. She took her books, a few changes of clothes, and the photograph from their graduation. She left behind the jewelry he'd bought her, the designer purse she'd never used, the entire life he thought she'd wanted. As she stood at the door, suitcase in hand, she finally looked at him. You know the saddest part, Anthony? It's not that you're leaving me, it's that you have no idea what you're losing. And then she was gone. He had told himself it was for the best. He had dived headfirst into his new life, finding Tiffany within a month. Tiffany was perfect. She was a walking, talking billboard for his success. He'd convinced himself that Maria had probably faded back into obscurity, a mousy librarian somewhere, just as he'd predicted. He had never once considered the alternative. He had never once considered that the small dusty world she inhabited might have held more power and value than his entire gilded empire. He had forgotten her final words. Now, standing on the cold marble floor of the New York Public Library, watching her laugh with Julian Devereux, he finally understood. He had no idea what he'd lost. He had just thrown away a diamond because he was too busy collecting glitter. The whispers in the Astor Hall grew from a murmur to a wave. Phones were being subtly raised not to snap pictures of the established celebrities, but to capture the shocking tableau at the entrance. The sight of Julian Devereux at a social event was rare enough to be a headline. The sight of him with a mysterious, breathtaking woman was a seismic event. For the few who recognized that woman as Anthony Spencer's unassuming ex-wife, it was the stuff of legend. Anthony felt 100 pairs of eyes on him. He could feel their pity, their schadenfreude. He was suddenly an object of ridicule. The man who had it all was now the man who'd thrown it all away. "Who is that?" Tiffany hissed, her perfectly applied lipstick twisted into a sneer of envy and confusion. "And why is everyone looking at us?" "That's—" Maria Anthony managed to choke out the name, feeling foreign and heavy in his mouth. Tiffany's eyes widened in disbelief. She squinted across the room. "That's your mousy ex-wife, the one who wore cardigans. No way. She must have had a ton of work done." "And who is she with Julian Devereux?" Anthony said, his voice flat. The name registered with Tiffany. Her jaw dropped. "The Julian Devereux, the Ethelred Innovations guy, the one who was on the cover of Time magazine." "But how? Why? The questions hammered at Anthony's skull. He watched as Maria and Julian began to move through the room. They weren't working it, not like he had been. They were simply present. People gravitated towards them. Old money matriarchs, whose icy glares could freeze a social climber at 20 paces, smiled warmly at Maria. Tech billionaires who usually traveled with an entourage approached Julian with a level of deference Anthony had never witnessed. Maria handled it all with an effortless grace that infuriated him. She spoke with a quiet confidence, her knowledge of art and history, the very things he'd dismissed as useless, now captivating the most powerful people in the city. She wasn't just a beautiful woman on a billionaire's arm. She was his equal. Anthony's pride, the very thing that had driven him to discard her, was now screaming at him to do something. He couldn't let this stand. He couldn't let her walk into his world and eclipse him so completely. He had to regain control of the narrative. "Come on," he said, grabbing Tiffany's arm with more force than he intended. "What are you doing?" she yelped. "I'm going to go to say hello," he said. His smile, a tight, predatory slash. He navigated them through the crowd, a shark sensing blood in the water, though he failed to realize it was his own. He intercepted them near the grand staircase, just as Maria was chatting with the curator of the Met. Well, 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 Anthony began, his voice oozing a false hearty bonhomie. Maria, I almost didn't recognize you. You clean up nicely. Maria's conversation with the curator paused. She turned to face him. Her expression was not one of shock or anger. It was one of mild, detached curiosity, the kind one might give to a slightly interesting, but ultimately insignificant insect. Julian Devereux's hand remained on her back, a silent, unmovable support. Anthony, she said, her voice calm and even. What a surprise to see you here. I could say the same about you. He shot back a smirk playing on his lips. He gestured vaguely at her expensive attire. Looks like you've done very well for yourself. Found a generous benefactor, I see. The insult was clear, crude, and designed to re-establish his dominance by painting her as a kept woman. Several people nearby fell silent, listening intently. Julian Devereux, who had been observing Anthony with a look of cold analysis, finally spoke. His voice was low and resonant, cutting through the air with absolute authority. I find it distasteful when a man attempts to take credit for a woman's success, and even more so when he attempts to diminish it. Anthony felt a chill. This was not a man to be trifled with. I'm just saying it's quite a transformation, Anthony stammered, trying to recover. It's not a transformation, Anthony Maria said, her gaze steady. It's a reclamation. I'm simply no longer hiding my light to make you feel more comfortable in your shadow. The verbal slap landed with precision. Before Anthony could retort, Tiffany, sensing an opportunity to assert her own value, stepped forward. Well, I think it's just wonderful that you found a hobby, she said to Maria, her tone dripping with condescension. Anthony told me you were always into old dusty things. It must be so fun to play dress-up and get taken to fancy parties. Maria looked at Tiffany, and for the first time a flicker of something, not pity, but perhaps amusement, danced in her eyes. It was Julian who answered, his tone dangerously soft. Maria's hobby, as you call it, is a bit more involved than that. Perhaps you missed the announcement in the Wall Street Journal last month. He paused, letting the silence hang. Anthony's mind raced. What announcement? He'd been so focused on his own deals, his own press. Julian continued, his eyes locked on Anthony. Ethelred Innovations recently endowed a new fund with a $200 million grant to acquire and revitalize the struggling Beauchamp Serrano Art Foundation. We needed someone with a unique combination of classical knowledge, historical perspective, and a sharp eye for undervalued cultural assets to run it. Someone who could see the soul in the old, dusty things. He smiled a thin, cutting smile. Allow me to introduce you to the new executive director of the Beauchamp Foundation, Ms. Maria Reyes, my fiancé. The word hit Anthony with the force of a physical blow. Not girlfriend, not companion, fiancé. The revelation rippled through the onlookers. Maria wasn't just a date. She wasn't a beneficiary. She was a director, a power player in her own right, helming a foundation with a budget that dwarfed Anthony's entire department's annual revenue. He had called her unambitious a liability, and she had, in the quiet years since he'd left, built an empire of her own in the very field he had mocked. Tiffany stood frozen, her catty remark having backfired in the most spectacular way possible. She had tried to belittle a woman who could now buy and sell her entire world. Anthony looked at Maria, truly looked at her, and saw a stranger. A formidable, brilliant, powerful stranger who had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. He had been so obsessed with the superficial glimmer of success that he had completely missed the solid gold right in front of him. And now that gold belonged to another man, a man who had been smart enough to recognize its true worth. The curator from the Met, who had been watching the entire exchange, smiled broadly at Maria. Director. Reyes, she said, her voice loud enough for all to hear. Now that the formalities are out of the way, you must tell me more about your plans for the new acquisitions. As Maria turned her back on Anthony, dismissing him as completely as if he were a piece of lint on her couture gown, and began an animated expert conversation, Anthony realized the night was no longer about him. He was a footnote in a story that was now and had always been about her. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread from Anthony's neck to his scalp. He was a ghost at the feast, invisible. The powerful figures he had spent the night courting now looked through him, their attention fixed on the new center of gravity in the room, Maria and Julian. He watched them move away, enveloped by a crowd of the city's true elite, leaving him and Tiffany standing alone in a wide, empty circle of shame. "Well, she's a bitch," Tiffany muttered, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "Who does she think she is?" "She's the executive director of the Beauchamp Foundation," Anthony said numbly, the words tasting like ash. "And she's engaged to Julian Devereux." "So, you're a vice president." "You're important," Tiffany insisted, but her words sounded hollow, a desperate chant against an encroaching darkness. Anthony knew the truth. His title, his bonus, his entire world was built on the perception of power. Julian Devereux didn't have to perceive power. He radiated it. In the ruthless calculus of this city, Anthony was a soldier, and he had just tried to stare down a king. His mind was a maelstrom of rage, jealousy, and a terrifying, creeping sense of dread. How had this happened? How had the mousy, compliant woman he'd discarded transformed into this powerhouse? It didn't make sense. There had to be more to the story. It was Devereux. Devereux must have plucked her from obscurity, polished her up, and given her this title as a bauble. Yes, that had to be it. She couldn't have done it on her own. This rationalization was the only thing holding his shattered ego together. He needed to believe it. He needed to confront her again, alone this time. He needed to break through this new, infuriatingly calm facade and find the old Maria, the one who looked at him with wounded eyes. He saw his chance a while later. Julian was deep in conversation with a senator, his back to the main hall. Maria had stepped away onto one of the library's secluded marble balconies to take a moment looking out over the glittering expanse of Bryant Park. "Stay here," he instructed Tiffany, and strode towards the balcony, ignoring her plaintive cry of his name. He found Maria leaning against the balustrade, the cool night air gently rustling the silk of her gown. She didn't seem surprised to see him. She simply turned her head, her expression unreadable in the moonlight. "It's a beautiful view," she said, her voice calm. "Cut the crap, Maria," he snarled, dropping all pretense of civility. "What is this? What's the game?" "There's no game, Anthony. Don't lie to me. You think I believe that story?" "Executive director. He gave you that title. He bought you this whole new life so he could have a pretty smart-sounding toy on his arm. You're no different from Tiffany. You just come with a better vocabulary." He wanted to wound her to see the flicker of pain that would prove he still had some power over her. Instead, she just looked at him with a profound, weary sadness. "Is that what you need to believe to sleep at night?" she asked softly. "That my success couldn't possibly be my own, that it has to be the gift of a powerful man. That's your narrative, Anthony. It was always your narrative. A woman's worth is only a reflection of the man she is with. It's the truth." He insisted, his voice rising. "You were nothing when I left you. You were working in a library, for God's sake." "Yes, I was," she said, her voice gaining a steely edge. "After you left, I was heartbroken. Not because I'd lost you. I think I'd lost the man I married long before that. I was heartbroken because I had poured everything I was into a vessel that was hollow. So I went back to the only thing that was truly mine, my work, my passion." She took a step closer, her eyes locking onto his. "I took a job in the archives of the Beauchamp Foundation. It was quiet, it was dusty, and it was heaven. I spent 2 years there surrounded by history. And in those archives, I made a discovery. I found proof that several paintings in their collection, long dismissed as copies, were in fact early works by the Renaissance master, Bellini, misattributed. For centuries. I wrote a paper. It was published. It caused quite a stir in the art world." Anthony stared at her dumbfounded. He'd never read an art journal in his life. He had no idea. My discovery brought the foundation a lot of attention. She continued, her voice steady and sure, including the attention of Julian Devereux, who, as you may know, is a passionate and very serious art collector. He wasn't looking for a pretty toy Anthony. He was looking for an expert. He sought me out. We talked for hours about art history and philosophy. He saw my mind before he ever saw me in a gown. The directorship wasn't a gift. I earned it. The endowment from his company was a result of the strategy I proposed to him for the Foundation's future. Every word was a nail in the coffin of Anthony's delusion. Her success wasn't borrowed. It was forged in the very fires of the passion he had mocked. His face contorted in a sneer of disbelief. You got lucky. You found some old paintings. That's not building a career. Was it luck, Anthony? She asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Or was it knowledge? The same way you got lucky with your first big trade at Sterling Coal. The one that put you on the map. Anthony froze. The trade. The one that had made his career. A risky bet on a small emerging biotech company. It had been his first multi-million-dollar win. It was the foundation of everything that followed. What about it? He said defensively. Maria's eyes were filled with an ancient, sorrowful knowledge. Do you remember right before we broke up, my Aunt Carol passed away? Anthony had a vague recollection. Maria had been sad for a week. He'd been annoyed it was distracting her from his needs. Yeah, so... She didn't have much, Maria said, but she left me everything she had. It was $50,000. Not a life-changing amount, but it was everything to me. A week later, you came home panicking about needing to secure a personal stake in an investment pool for that biotech company, Synthogenetics. And you said you needed $50,000 by the next morning, or you'd lose the opportunity of a lifetime. The blood drained from Anthony's face. He remembered. He remembered desperately needing the capital to get in on the deal. He had maxed out his credit cards, but it wasn't enough. I remember you telling me your bonus had come through. Early, Maria continued, her voice a quiet indictment. You seemed so relieved. The lie he had told, buried under years of self-aggrandizement, was suddenly unearthed. He hadn't gotten an early bonus. The money he'd used. That $50,000, Anthony Maria said, her voice breaking with the weight of the old betrayal. The money that launched your entire career. The foundation of this life you're so proud of. It wasn't your bonus, it was my inheritance. I transferred it to your account that night while you were sleeping because I still believed in us. I still believed in you. You never even noticed it was gone from my savings. You never asked. You just took the win and kept climbing. The world tilted on its axis. He had built his kingdom on her grief. He had taken the last piece of her past and used it to fund his future, a future that explicitly excluded her. His great success wasn't his at all. It was hers. The ultimate liability, the small woman he'd cast aside, had been the silent, uncredited investor in his entire life. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, to say anything, but no words came. There was nothing to say. The lie was too big, and the truth was too damning. He was a fraud, and the one person in the world who knew it was standing right in front of him, no longer his victim, but his judge. The silence on the balcony was absolute, broken only by the distant sounds of the city and the frantic hammering of Anthony's heart. The foundation of his identity, the self-made man, the corporate shark, the master of his own destiny, had crumbled into dust. He wasn't a builder. He was a thief. You're lying, he whispered, but the words had no conviction. The memory, sharp and sickening, was resurfacing. The panic, the desperate search for funds, and then the sudden miraculous appearance of the exact amount he needed in his account. He had told himself it was a bank error in his favor or an early bonus processing. He had deliberately chosen not to question it, not to look too closely, because the hunger for success had been all-consuming. Why would I lie? Anthony Maria's voice was devoid of malice. It was worse. It was full of a devastating clarity. What would be the point? I'm not telling you this for revenge. I'm telling you so you understand. The life you have isn't something you built in spite of me. In many ways, you built it because of me. The least you could do is have the grace to own that. Grace. He had no grace left. Only a raw primal fury born of total exposure. He was a fraud, and she knew it. Julian Devereux, a man whose respect he craved, was just meters away. If he found out, "You're going to tell him," Anthony accused, his voice low and venomous. "You're going to tell everyone and ruin me." "Ruin you?" A small, sad smile touched her lips. "You think I've spent the last 5 years plotting your downfall? Anthony, you haven't been a character in my story for a very long time. You're a footnote in the prologue. This isn't about you. This was never about you." Her dismissal was more painful than any threat. To be so insignificant to her, after he had made her the villain in his own story for so long, was the ultimate degradation. His mind snapped. The carefully controlled facade of the cool-headed VP shattered, and the desperate, insecure man from Sunnyside, Queens, clawed his way out. He lunged forward, grabbing her arm. "You owe me. Everything you are now is because I pushed you away. I motivated you. I made you who you are." Maria flinched, not in fear but in shock at his crudeness. "Let go of me, Anthony. You will not dismiss me." He seethed, his grip tightening. "You think you're better than me now with your billionaire and your fancy title? You're still the same little girl from the state university who got lucky. I think you've made your point." The new voice was quiet, yet it carried the chilling authority of a death sentence. Julian Devereux stood at the entrance to the balcony. He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. His eyes, fixed on Anthony's hand, clamped around Maria's arm, were colder than the marble floor. Anthony snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. We were just talking." Julian ignored him completely. He walked to Maria's side, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "Are you all right, my love? I'm fine," she said, her composure returning instantly in his presence. She straightened the sleeve of her gown. Julian then turned his full, undivided attention to Anthony. The ambient power that usually radiated from him was now focused into a laser beam of pure Arctic contempt. "Spencer," he said the name, sounding like something distasteful he was scraping off his shoe. "I have seen men of ambition and men of desperation. It is a rare and pathetic thing to see a man who is so nakedly both." Anthony felt his throat close up. This was it. The end. "I was under the impression that Sterling Cole Capital valued discretion and professionalism in its senior partners." Julian continued, his voice a silken threat. "I imagine their board and their clients, many of whom are my personal friends, would be concerned to learn that a senior vice president conducts himself like a common thug publicly harassing women at a charity function." Every word was a perfectly aimed shot. Julian wasn't just threatening Anthony's social standing, he was threatening his entire career. A single phone call from this man, a whispered word at the right golf club, and everything Anthony had worked for would be gone. The deals would dry up, the invitations would stop, his name would become poison. "Now I am going to escort my fiancé back to the party," Julian said, his eyes boring into Anthony's. "And you are going to vanish. I don't want to see your face again tonight. I don't want to hear your name. If you so much as breathe in Maria's direction again, I will not call your board of directors. I will call my lawyers, and we will embark on a forensic audit of every deal you have ever touched. I assure you, Mr. Spencer, no one's past is clean enough to survive that kind of scrutiny. Least of all yours." The veiled reference to Anthony's financial history, a history Julian couldn't possibly know the sordid details of yet, seemed to intuit with terrifying accuracy, was the checkmate. Anthony stood paralyzed, drenched in a cold sweat. He had come here tonight a king. He was leaving a condemned man, his sentence delivered not by a court of law, but by a court of power. He had no hope of appealing. Julian placed a hand on Maria's back. his gesture a stark contrast to Anthony's earlier violent grab. It was protective, respectful. "Come, Maria, Mrs. Astor Vanderbilt was just asking about your Bellini research." As they turned to leave, Maria paused and looked back at Anthony one last time. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hatred, only a deep, profound pity. It was the look one gives to a relic of a forgotten past, an artifact of a life long since moved on from. Then she turned and walked away, with her future leaving Anthony alone on the balcony with the ruins of his. The great Anthony Spencer, reduced to nothing more than the villain in someone else's success story. He had tried to play chess with the gods of Manhattan, and they had just swept him from the board. The walk back into the Grand Hall was the longest of Anthony's life. The whispers that had been subtle before were now open, the stairs pointed and merciless. The news of the confrontation on the balcony, undoubtedly overheard, and already spreading like wildfire, had sealed his fate. He was a social leper. He found Tiffany right where he'd left her, looking frantic. "Anthony, what happened? People are saying Julian Devereux threatened you." "Get your coat," he said, his voice a hollow rasp. He didn't look at her. He couldn't look at anyone. "But the party's not over." "We haven't even had dessert," she protested, the triviality of her concern, a grating insult to the magnitude of his ruin. "The party is over for us," he snapped, grabbing her arm and pulling her towards the exit, past the smiling faces that now seemed to mock him. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. He knew what he would see: Maria surrounded by light and laughter, holding court in a world that had once been his ultimate goal, a world he had now been permanently exiled from. The ride home was silent. Tiffany, for once, seemed to understand that her usual chatter would be unwelcome. The scent of her perfume, which had seemed so glamorous hours ago, now smelled cloying and cheap. The Maybach felt like a hearse carrying the corpse of his ambitions back to an empty penthouse that felt more like a tomb than a home. He walked into his apartment and went straight to the bar, pouring a large glass of Macallan 25. He downed it in one gulp, the burn in his throat doing nothing to erase the icy dread in his stomach. He was done. Julian Devereux was a man of his word. By morning, the calls would begin. His superiors at Sterling Coal would summon him. His career was over. And for what? For a pride so fragile it couldn't bear the thought of his ex-wife's success. Tiffany watched him, her face a mask of anxiety. "Anthony, talk to me. Is it really that bad?" He finally looked at her perfectly constructed beauty, her expensive dress, her vacant eyes. She was the trophy he had wanted, the symbol of his arrival. And now she was just a painful reminder of the terrible trade he had made. He had traded substance for surface gold, for glitter. He had traded Maria for this. "Yes, Tiffany," he said, his voice flat and dead. "It's that bad." Across town, in the back of a discreetly elegant Rolls-Royce, Maria leaned her head against Julian's shoulder. The adrenaline from the confrontation had faded, leaving behind a quiet sense of peace. The diamond necklace he'd given her felt warm against her skin. "Are you sure you're all right?" Julian asked again, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "I am," she said. And she knew it was true. For years, a part of me felt defined by the way he left me, as if his judgment of me was the final word. Tonight I realized it was just his opinion, and his opinion doesn't matter. "It never did," Julian said softly. "I knew who you were the moment I read your paper on Bellini. Before I even met you, I knew I was dealing with a mind of immense beauty and integrity. The rest was just a very, very welcome bonus." She smiled, a real unburdened smile. "He built his whole career on my inheritance." She had told Julian the full story on the way out of the gala. He had listened patiently, his expression hardening only slightly. "I know," he said. Maria looked up, surprised. "You know, I suspected," he clarified. "When I decided you were going to be a part of my life, I had my security team do a standard confidential background check on both of you for your protection." The $50,000 transfer from your account to his, one day before he made the defining trade of his career, was a rather glaring flag. I never mentioned it because it was your story to tell or to keep. But know this, if he had harmed you tonight in any way, I would have used that information to ensure he never worked in this hemisphere again. Maria felt a wave of warmth spread through her chest. It was the feeling of being truly seen, truly protected, not out of ownership, but out of deep, abiding respect. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me." "Always," he replied, lifting her hand to his lips. "So, Director Reyes, now that we've survived the New York social scene, what's next on your agenda for world domination?" She laughed. The sound free and light. "First, I plan to acquire the lost collection of the Marquis de Sansé. Then, after a brief stop in Florence to authenticate a newly discovered sketch by Da Vinci, I was thinking we could finally take that trip to Greece you promised me. I want to show you the Parthenon at sunrise." He smiled, his eyes full of adoration. "An empire of beauty and knowledge. I like it." "And our home base?" Maria looked out the window as the Rolls-Royce pulled up to the curb, not in front of a cold penthouse, but a beautiful stately brownstone on a quiet tree-lined street in Gramercy Park, their home. "I think we're already there," she said. She had walked into that gala tonight, nervous and uncertain, half expecting to still feel the sting of her past. But she walked out free. Her triumph wasn't in Anthony's ruin, but in her own becoming. She hadn't needed to shut down the night. By simply being herself, the night had rearranged itself around her. Anthony Spencer hadn't been defeated by a billionaire's power or a beautiful gown. He had been defeated by the quiet, unyielding power of a woman who finally knew her own worth. In the end, this wasn't merely a story of revenge. It was a profound narrative of reclamation. It serves as a powerful reminder that the brightest spotlights we can ever stand in are the ones we generate from within. Anthony Spencer's life, for all its outward gloss and glamour, was a gilded cage built on a stolen foundation, a house of cards destined to collapse under the weight of its own dishonesty. He chased external validation, viewing people as assets and liabilities, and in his blindness, he tragically miscalculated the true worth of the woman beside him. Maria's journey, in stark contrast, was a quiet renaissance. She didn't seek to outshine Anthony in his world. She simply reignited her own. Her power wasn't found in a designer gown or a billionaire's affection, but in the silent archives of a library, in the rediscovery of her passion, and in the unshakable confidence that comes from embracing your own intellect and spirit. Her triumph teaches us that authenticity is the ultimate superpower. What was the true moment of Anthony's downfall? Was it when he left Maria, when he confronted her at the gala, or the second he decided her inheritance was his for the taking? Do you believe a person like Anthony can ever truly understand what they lost? Let's discuss this story of poetic justice in the comments below. He thought the greatest day of his life was the day she left. He saw her a year later, a ghost from his past, dressed in what he called pathetic simple clothes. He laughed standing beside his glamorous fiancée, a woman draped in a one-of-a-kind designer gown that screamed wealth and success. But what he didn't know, what the whole world was about to find out, was that the woman he was mocking, his insignificant ex-wife Evelyn, hadn't just admired that dress. She had sketched it, stitched it, and created it. This is the story of how a man's cruel mockery became the spotlight for his own public humiliation. The air in the Corinthian ballroom was thick with the scent of money and lilies. It was the annual fundraiser for the Children's Foundation, a night where New York's elite gathered to outbid, outdress, and outshine one another under the guise of philanthropy. Arthur Penhaligon navigated the glittering crowd with the practiced ease of a man who believed he was born to be in such rooms. On his arm, a perfect accessory to his tailored Tom Ford suit, was Bethany Cole, his fiancée. Her laughter was like the chime of tiny expensive bells, and her presence turned heads, mostly because of the dress. The dress was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk that seemed to drink the light of the chandeliers. It fell in a column, simple in its silhouette, but breathtakingly complex in its construction. A cascade of hand-stitched, gunmetal grey beadwork traced the line of her collarbone and wrapped around one shoulder, resembling a delicate frozen branch of a winter tree. It was elegant, exclusive, and whispered a price tag that would make most people gasp. Arthur was preening. Every admiring glance at Bethany was a victory for him. It was validation. He had traded up. He had won. And then he saw her. Across the room, near a less populated bar, stood Evelyn Reed, his ex-wife. It took him a moment to be sure. She looked different, smaller somehow. She was dressed in a simple charcoal grey sheath dress made of a soft matty fabric. It had long sleeves, a modest neckline, and fell just below her knees. Her hair was pulled back into a neat low ponytail, and her face was almost bare of makeup. Beside the shimmering peacocking crowd, she looked like a sparrow in a flock of birds of paradise. A nasty, triumphant smile curled Arthur's lip. "Well, well," he murmured to Bethany, his voice a low thrum of condescension. "Look what the cat dragged in." Bethany followed his gaze, her perfectly sculpted brows furrowing slightly. "Who is that, Evelyn?" My ex-Arthur said the word ex, laced with a satisfaction that was almost palpable. "Can you believe it? I haven't seen her since the divorce. Looks like life hasn't been too kind." He decided to approach her. It was a power move, a public demonstration of his new improved life. Bethany, sensing the drama, clung to his arm, a silent co-conspirator. Evelyn was speaking to the bartender when Arthur's shadow fell over her. "Evelyn," he said, his voice offensively smooth. She turned, and her eyes, a calm, clear grey, met his. There was a flicker of surprise, but it was quickly masked by a polite, neutral expression. "Arthur," she acknowledged, her voice even. She glanced at the woman on his arm. "I'd like you to meet my fiancée, Bethany Cole," Arthur announced, practically puffing out his chest. "Bethany, this is Evelyn Reed." "A pleasure," Bethany said, her eyes doing a swift, dismissive scan of Evelyn's simple attire. The judgment was clear. "You too?" Evelyn replied, her gaze briefly falling on the midnight blue dress. A strange, unreadable emotion passed through her eyes before she met Bethany's gaze again. "That's a stunning gown." Bethany brightened instantly. "Oh, thank you. It's a custom piece from a new designer, Aura. Have you heard of them?" "Probably not. They're incredibly exclusive. It took my father's connections just to get a consultation." Arthur chuckled, a sound devoid of any real humor. "I don't think Aura is on Evelyn's radar, darling. She always did favor minimalism." He gestured vaguely at her charcoal dress. "Still keeping it simple, I see. Very practical." The insult was designed to sting, to remind her of every time he had criticized her for not being flashy enough, for preferring quality and comfort over loud brand names. During their marriage, he had constantly tried to mold her into a society wife, buying her clothes. She hated pushing her into circles where she felt like an imposter. Her refusal, her quiet insistence on being herself, had been a major point of contention. Evelyn's composure didn't crack. She simply offered a small, tight smile. "Practicality has its merits, Arthur. It lasts. So do investments." Arthur shot back pointedly, adjusting the cufflink that peeked from his sleeve. "And I've always believed in investing in the best. Bethany looks like a queen, don't you think? She looks beautiful." Evelyn agreed, her voice still unnervingly calm. The lack of a wounded reaction was starting to irritate Arthur. He wanted to see a flash of envy, a hint of regret. He saw nothing. It was like talking to a placid lake. "Well, we should be getting back to our table," he said, his tone dismissive. "It was interesting seeing you, Evelyn. Try to enjoy the canapes." With a final triumphant smirk, he steered Bethany away, leaving Evelyn standing alone at the bar. "My God, she was dreary," Bethany whispered once they were out of earshot. "That dress looked like something my grandmother would wear to a funeral." You were married to that. A youthful mistake, Arthur said, waving a hand as if to erase the memory. She had no ambition, no understanding of how the world works. It's all about presentation, darling. Always has been. The life I have with you, this, he squeezed her arm, this is the life I was meant for. He glanced back across the ballroom. Evelyn was no longer at the bar. She had vanished back into the sea of anonymous faces, a plain grey stone swallowed by a glittering tide. He felt a surge of pride. He had shown her exactly what she had lost. He had stood before her, a titan of success, with a goddess on his arm, while she looked like a forgotten relic. He was completely, blissfully, and catastrophically unaware that the foundation of his entire triumphant moment, the very dress that symbolized his victory, was an intricate lie that was about to unravel his entire world. The Corinthian ballroom's opulence felt a world away from the quiet, ordered sanctuary of Evelyn's studio. Located on the third floor of a pre-war building in a district known more for its artisan bakeries than its high-fashion boutiques, the space was her haven. It was one large room with soaring ceilings and massive paned windows that flooded the space with the soft grey light of the city. One wall was covered in corkboard, a chaotic but meticulous collage of fabric swatches, charcoal sketches, and anatomical drawings of the human form in motion. Mannequins stood like silent sentinels, some bare others draped in muslin prototypes. Bolts of exquisite fabric, cashmere silk, charmeuse, and heavy wool crepe were stacked neatly on industrial shelving. The only sound was the gentle hum of her professional-grade sewing machine and the quiet scratch of a pencil against thick paper. Evelyn sat at her large drafting table, her back straight, the charcoal dress she'd worn to the gala still on. She wasn't designing, she was simply holding a pencil, staring at a blank sheet. The encounter with Arthur hadn't broken her, but it had left a deep, familiar ache. His words echoed in her mind, still keeping it simple, very practical. He had always used the word simple like a weapon, equating it with unambitious and lacking. He couldn't comprehend that for Evelyn, simplicity was the ultimate sophistication. It was about stripping away the non-essential to reveal the perfect line, the flawless cut, the soul of the garment. It was a philosophy she had poured into her work, into her life, and into the very brand she was building. A key turned in the lock and the door opened to reveal Finn O'Connell, her business partner and fiercely loyal friend. He was a whirlwind of creative energy, with a shock of red hair that refused to be tamed, and eyes that sparkled with mischief and intelligence. He took one look at her rigid posture and the untouched sketchbook and knew. So he said, setting 2 cups of coffee on the table, "You saw him." Evelyn finally looked up, her grey eyes clouded. And his fiancée, Bethany Cole. Ah, the coal heiress. Of coal, mining and minerals. Of course, Finn said, his tone dripping with disdain. He leaned against the table. Let me guess, he was a complete ass. A small, wry smile touched Evelyn's lips. He hasn't changed. He mocked my dress. Finn glanced at her charcoal sheath. The Clara, one of our best sellers from the ready-to-wear line. The one that sold out in 3 days on Net-a-Porter. That dress, the very same, Evelyn confirmed. He called it practical. Finn snorted. The man wouldn't know good design if it bit him on his perfectly tailored backside. What about the fiancée? What was she wearing? This was the question Evelyn had been dreading and anticipating. She took a slow sip of her coffee, the warmth a small comfort. She was wearing the Celeste. Finn froze his coffee cup halfway to his lips. He stared at her. The Celeste Wambig gown was not part of their ready-to-wear collection. It was a couture piece, a one-of-a-kind commission. It was the dress with the midnight silk and the hand-beaded gunmetal branch. It was to date the most ambitious, expensive, and difficult piece their small atelier had ever produced. No, Finn, whispered, a slow grin spreading across his face. You're kidding me. She was wearing the dress. The very same, Evelyn repeated, a hint of the night's strange irony finally bubbling to the surface. She was very proud of it. Told me it was by an exclusive new designer called Aura. Finn threw his head back and roared with laughter. It was a loud, joyous sound that filled the quiet studio, chasing away the lingering ghosts of the ballroom. Oh, that is rich. That is poetic justice of the highest order. The man who mocked your clothes is paying a fortune to drape his new toy in them. He has no idea, does he? None whatsoever. Evelyn said, the tightness in her chest finally beginning to loosen. Aura was her creation born from the ashes of her marriage. When she and Arthur divorced, she had taken her settlement, a sum he'd considered a paltry but fair price to be rid of her, and poured every cent into this studio. She had made a conscious decision to separate her name, Evelyn Reed, from her work. Her name was tainted by its association with him, by the society pages that had painted her as his dowdy, uninteresting wife. She wanted her designs to stand on their own, and so Aura was born. It was anonymous, mysterious. There was no face to the brand, only a philosophy, understated, luxury, impeccable craftsmanship, and timeless design. Finn handled the business and marketing masterfully, building a cult following based on whispers and exclusivity. They started with a small, ready-to-wear collection, sold through a few high-end online retailers. The pieces, like the Clara dress Evelyn wore, were praised for their quality and cut. The couture line was a new, more ambitious venture. They took on only a handful of commissions, vetted through a discreet agent. The client never met the designer. All communication went through the agent, ensuring Evelyn's anonymity. The Celeste gown for Bethany Cole had been their biggest commission yet. Evelyn had spent over 200 hours on the beadwork alone, her fingers raw, her eyes strained, pouring her pain, her resilience, and her artistry into every tiny stitch. The dress was a piece of her soul. "And you didn't say a word?" Finn asked, his eyes dancing. "Oh, to have been a fly on that wall. You just stood there and let him mock the Clara while his fiancé was wearing your masterpiece." "What was I to say?" Evelyn asked, her voice quiet. "Arthur, you colossal fool. You just paid a down payment on a condominium for the dress your fiancé is wearing. And it was made by me, the woman you called worthless." "Yes, that's exactly what you should have said," Finn exclaimed. "I would have paid to see his face." "No," Evelyn said, shaking her head. "That's his game. Public scenes, grand gestures, humiliation. My success has nothing to do with him. Aura's success is about the work. It has to remain that way." Finn's expression softened. He understood. This wasn't about revenge for Evelyn, not in the way Arthur would understand it. This was about reclamation. It was about proving to herself that the part of her Arthur had tried to extinguish her creativity, her quiet strength, was actually her greatest asset. "Okay, boss," he said gently. "But you have to admit there's a certain delicious irony to it all." "The irony is not lost on me," she admitted, a genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. She looked around her studio at the tools of her trade, the evidence of her hard work. This was her world, not the Corinthian ballroom, not Arthur Penhaligon's sphere of influence. She had spent years feeling small in his shadow. That night, for the first time, she realized she wasn't in his shadow at all. She was in her own light, a light so bright he couldn't even see it. He just saw a simple grey dress, while unknowingly basking in the glow of her true brilliant work. The game had changed, and Arthur didn't even know he was a player. In the weeks following the fundraiser, the name Aura became something of a mantra in the Penhaligon Cole household, or rather in the sleek, minimalist penthouse apartment Arthur had purchased in anticipation of his new life with Bethany. Bethany was obsessed. "They say she's a total recluse," she said one evening, scrolling feverishly through a fashion blog on her tablet. She was lounging on a vast white sofa that had cost more than Evelyn's first car. The designer. No one has ever seen her. Some people think Aura is a collective of European artisans. Others say it's the secret side project of a famous, established designer who wants to be more experimental. Arthur grunted from behind his laptop. He was reviewing market analytics. His brow furrowed in concentration. A major energy stock he'd bet heavily on had taken a sudden sharp downturn, and it was making him nervous. As long as they keep making dresses that make you look good. Who cares, he said, not looking up. I care, Bethany retorted, tossing the tablet onto the cushion beside her. It's about more than the dress, Arthur. It's about the story, the mystery. Genevieve Dubois just mentioned them in her latest column. She called Aura the most exciting new voice in couture. The name Genevieve Dubois made Arthur pause. Dubois was the editor-in-chief of Elan, the undisputed Bible of the fashion world. Her word could make or break a brand overnight. If she was praising Aura, then Bethany's dress wasn't just a dress. It was a cultural artifact. Good, he said, trying to sound pleased. That means your investment paid off. I want another one, Bethany declared. Arthur finally looked up from his screen. Another one, Bethany. That dress cost a fortune, and it was worth every penny I want Aura to design my wedding dress. Arthur's jaw tightened. The wedding was 6 months away, a lavish affair at her family's sprawling estate in the Hamptons. It was more than a wedding, it was a merger. The union of Penhaligon ambition and Cole old money. He was counting on the financial stability this marriage would bring him, especially now with his portfolio looking increasingly volatile. He needed to keep Bethany happy, but a custom Aura wedding gown, the cost would be astronomical. Darling, that's a wonderful idea, he said, forcing a smile. But you said yourself how hard it was to get the first one. Are you sure they even do wedding gowns? I've already had my father's assistant reach out to the agent. Bethany said, her tone triumphant. They're considering it. They want a design proposal and a full creative brief. They're playing hard to get, which only makes me want it more. Arthur felt a prickle of annoyance. He was a man who moved markets, who commanded respect. The idea of having to court some mysterious, faceless designer for the privilege of giving them an obscene amount of money was galling. It flew in the face of his entire worldview, where money and status were the keys that opened every door. It's just a dress, Bethany? He said, his patience wearing thin. No, it's the dress, she shot back, her voice rising. Don't you get it? This is our wedding. Genevieve Dubois will be there. Everyone will be there. I want to be wearing Aura. It says that we're on the inside, that we're ahead of the curve. Arthur sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He saw the logic in her argument. The wedding was a performance, and they needed the right costumes. An Aura gown would be a statement. It would cement their status as the city's new power couple. It was an investment in their brand. All right, he conceded. All right, see what their agent says. He returned to his laptop, but his concentration was broken. He thought back to the night of the gala, to Evelyn in her drab little dress. The contrast between her and Bethany had been so satisfying. Evelyn represented his past, quiet, unassuming, and in his mind utterly devoid of the hunger required to succeed. Bethany was his future, bright, bold, and draped in the very definition of success. Yet there was a nagging dissonance. Evelyn's calmness at the gala had been unsettling. She should have been devastated. She should have looked up at him with longing and regret. Instead, she had looked at him with something that almost resembled pity. It was absurd. What could she possibly have to pity him for? His phone buzzed. It was a market alert. The energy stock had dropped another 4%. A knot of cold dread tightened in his stomach. He was more exposed on this position than he'd let on to anyone, even Bethany. He had leveraged other assets to increase his stake, sure of a quick and massive return. It had been a gamble, a move to secure the kind of wealth that would finally place him beyond the reach of the old money snobbery of families like the Coles. Now that gamble was threatening to blow up in his face. He looked over at Bethany, who was once again lost in her tablet, happily pinning ideas for her Aura-designed wedding. Her family's fortune was the safety net he was counting on. The wedding couldn't just happen. It had to be perfect. Her happiness was paramount. Suddenly, the Aura dress wasn't just a frivolous expense anymore. It was a critical component of the plan. It was the price of keeping the dream alive. Find out what they need, he said, his voice harder than before. Whatever the cost, whatever they want, get it done. Bethany looked up, a radiant smile on her face. I knew you'd understand. He didn't understand. Not really. He didn't understand the obsession, the mystery, or the power this invisible designer held. He just understood that in his world, which was beginning to show faint but terrifying cracks, appearances were everything. And the appearance of success, symbolized by a dress from a designer named Aura, was something he desperately needed to maintain. The name Aura began to spread through the elite circles of New York like a secret language. It was a whisper at cocktail parties, a name drop in the front rows of Fashion Week, a tag on the most exclusive social media accounts. The mystery surrounding the designer only fueled the brand's meteoric rise. Aura wasn't just fashion, it was a phenomenon. Finn was a master at stoking the flames. He orchestrated a series of calculated leaks and placements. A renowned actress was photographed at LAX wearing an Aura cashmere travel set looking effortlessly chic. A French heiress was spotted in St. Bart's in a deceptively simple Aura linen sundress. Each piece was instantly recognizable by its cut and quality, yet devoid of any logo. The lack of branding became the brand. Then came the feature in Elan. Genevieve Dubois dedicated a full 2 pages to Aura, not with flashy photographs, but with elegant prose and artistic sketches of the designs. The article, titled "The Architecture of Silence," was a love letter to the brand's philosophy. In an age of deafening logos and celebrity-driven spectacle, Dubois wrote, "Aura is a radical act of quiet confidence." The anonymous designer, rumored to be a single fiercely private artisan, is not selling a name but a feeling. The garments are an intimate conversation between fabric and form. To wear Aura is not to scream, "Look at me," but to command attention with the sheer force of impeccable construction and understated grace. This is not fashion for the masses. It is armor for the discerning, a secret shared among those who understand that true luxury doesn't need to shout. Evelyn kept a copy of the magazine open on her desk. She had read the article a dozen times, each time feeling a thrill that was entirely her own. Armor for the discerning. Dubois understood. She understood what Evelyn was trying to do. The success was both exhilarating and terrifying. The demand was exploding. Finn was fielding calls from major department stores, from stylists, from investors, wanting to buy a piece of the mystery. "We're at a crossroads," Finn said one afternoon, pacing the studio floor. "We can't stay a 2-person operation forever. The ready-to-wear line needs to scale up or we'll be crushed by the demand. And the couture requests are insane." The crown princess of a minor European nation wants a gown for the royal wedding. Evelyn felt a wave of vertigo. A princess. It was all happening so fast. "We're not ready for that kind of expansion, Finn. The quality is everything. If we scale up too quickly, we lose what makes Aura special." "I know," he said, stopping to look at her. "Which is why we need to be strategic. I've found a small family-owned atelier in Italy that can handle a larger production run of the ready-to-wear line. The quality is superb. It would free you up to focus purely on the couture and the core design." It was a sensible solution, but Evelyn hesitated. It meant letting go, trusting others with her vision. It was another step out of the shadows and into a much larger world. Meanwhile, Arthur Penhaligon was also reading Genevieve Dubois' article. He'd found it on Bethany's nightstand. He read the words, "Quiet confidence, understated. Grace doesn't need to shout," and felt a strange sense of cognitive dissonance. They were concepts he associated with weakness, with his ex-wife. How could they possibly be the description of the world's most coveted luxury brand? It didn't compute. To him, luxury was a megaphone. It was a Bugatti, a Patek Philippe, a front row seat. It was loud, but the world, at least this influential corner of it, was telling him he was wrong. "Did you see?" Bethany asked, coming into the room, wrapped in a silk robe. She called us the discerning. She had completely co-opted the brand's identity as her own. In her mind, by wearing aura, she was aura. I saw Arthur said, closing the magazine. Their agent has been in touch, by the way. Bethany squealed with delight. And what did they say about the wedding dress? Arthur felt a familiar pang of annoyance at having to report the news. They're particular. They've agreed to consider the commission. But they have terms. Terms? What terms? First, a non-refundable design deposit of $50,000, just to create the initial sketches. Bethany didn't even blink. To her, it was a rounding error. To Arthur, whose finances were becoming more precarious by the day, it was a gut punch. Second, he continued, his voice tight. The designer Aura insists on a private meeting with the bride, alone, to understand her essence before beginning the design process. A meeting? Bethany gasped. A real meeting? With Aura? Oh my God, Arthur. No one gets to meet Aura. I'll be the first. What will I wear? What will I say? She was already spiraling into a vortex of excited preparation. Arthur, however, was stuck on the absurdity of the situation. This phantom designer was now dictating terms to him, summoning his fiancé, like a queen summoning a courtier. The meeting is to be held at the designer's private atelier, he added, reading from the agent's email on his phone. No photographs, no companions, and the location will only be disclosed 24 hours in advance. A non-disclosure agreement is required. It's all so mysterious, so chic. Bethany swooned. This is perfect. Absolutely perfect. Arthur watched her, a cold feeling creeping up his spine. The world was changing, and the rules he had always played by seemed to be shifting under his feet. Power, he was discovering, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was silent. Sometimes it was a mysterious, unseen woman who could command a $50,000 deposit for a sketch and summon the city's most sought-after heiress to a secret meeting. He hated it. He hated the feeling of not being in control. But he was trapped. He needed the Cole family money, and the price of that was Bethany's happiness. And the price of her happiness was now inextricably linked to this ghost named Aura. Unbeknownst to him, in a quiet studio across town, the ghost was preparing for the meeting. Evelyn stood before a mannequin draped in ivory silk. She was sketching not a wedding dress, but a plan for a conversation. She felt a strange sense of calm. She wasn't nervous about meeting the woman who had replaced her. She was curious. This wasn't about revenge. It was about research. Bethany Cole was the embodiment of the world Arthur had wanted Evelyn to be a part of. To design the ultimate dress for her, Evelyn needed to understand that world, not as an outsider, but from the inside. She needed to understand the woman Arthur had chosen. She needed to understand what he valued. And in doing so, perhaps she could finally fully understand why he had never valued her. The day of the meeting arrived cloaked in a shroud of secrecy that Bethany found thrilling and Arthur found deeply irritating. A black car dispatched by the Aura agent arrived at their penthouse precisely at 2 o'clock. Bethany, having spent the entire morning agonizing over her outfit, finally settled on a Dior pantsuit, powerful but respectful, and emerged looking like she was about to negotiate a corporate merger. "I can't believe you're not allowed to come," she said to Arthur, for the 10th time adjusting the collar of her jacket. "Just remember what we talked about," Arthur said, his tone that of a coach sending a player into the big game. "Be charming, emphasize the prestige of the wedding, the guest list. Make sure this Aura person understands that this isn't just any commission, it's a career-making opportunity." Bethany rolled her eyes. "I think Aura is already doing just fine, Arthur. Try not to worry. I'll be back in a few hours, hopefully, with a wedding dress in the works." She kissed him on the cheek and swept out of the apartment. Arthur watched from the window as the black car pulled away, a small, dark vessel disappearing into the city's vast circulatory system. He felt completely powerless, a feeling he utterly despised. He paced the length of his living room, the polished floor reflecting his agitated form. To distract himself, he decided to do what he did best: investigate. He opened his laptop and typed Aura Designer Atelier location into the search bar. The results were, as expected, fruitless. Message boards were filled with speculation, but there was no concrete information. The brand's digital footprint was a masterclass in controlled anonymity. Frustrated, he called a man he knew named Patrick, a private investigator he occasionally used for discreet corporate due diligence. Patrick was expensive, but he was good. Patrick Arthur said, his voice clipped. "I have a small personal project for you. It's time sensitive." "Name it," came the gruff reply. "A fashion brand. Aura. I want to know who is behind it. I want a name, an address, a history, everything. Aura." Patrick sounded surprised. "That's a tough one, Mr. Penhaligon. They're famously airtight." "Everyone has a weakness," Arthur snapped. "Follow the money. The corporate filings. The agent they use. The car service they hired today. I want an answer by the end of the day." "It'll cost you," Patrick warned. "Just get it done," Arthur said, and hung up. Meanwhile, Bethany's car was weaving its way out of the familiar territory of Midtown and into a neighborhood she rarely, if ever, ventured into. The skyscrapers gave way to older, more uniform buildings of brick and stone. The storefronts changed from global luxury brands to independent bookstores and small artisanal shops. The car finally stopped in front of an unassuming grey stone building with a discreet black-painted door. There was no sign, no plaque. A woman in a simple, elegant black dress was waiting. "Miss Cole," she asked politely. "This way, please." Bethany was led through the door and up 3 flights of stairs. The air grew quieter with each step. The woman opened a final door and gestured for Bethany to enter. "Aura will be with you shortly." Bethany stepped inside, and the door closed softly behind her, leaving her alone. The room was breathtaking. It was not the opulent, velvet-draped salon she had imagined. It was a working studio, vast, airy, and filled with light. Bolts of fabric were stacked like a library of textures. Sketches were pinned to a wall. Mannequins stood in thoughtful poses. The room smelled of clean linen charcoal and something floral like jasmine tea. It felt sacred. She wandered deeper into the room, running her hand over a bolt of heavy silk. The quality was undeniable. She saw a dress in progress on one of the mannequins, a column of deep emerald green, its seams pinned with surgical precision. This was a place of serious work. "Miss Cole, thank you for coming." The voice was quiet, calm, and came from behind her. Bethany turned. Standing there was a woman. She was dressed simply in tailored black trousers and a soft, cream-colored cashmere sweater. Her hair was pulled back, and her face was intelligent and serene. She looked familiar, but Bethany couldn't place her. There was an air of quiet authority about her, but she wasn't what Bethany had expected at all. She had pictured some flamboyant, eccentric artist. This woman was composed. "You're Aura?" Bethany asked, a little thrown. "I am the designer behind Aura," the woman said with a small, polite smile. She did not offer her name. "Please have a seat. Can I offer you some tea?" They sat in 2 simple but elegant armchairs near the large windows. The woman Aura poured tea into delicate ceramic cups. She moved with an unhurried grace that Bethany found both calming and slightly intimidating. "Your celestial magic gown was a pleasure to create." Aura began, her voice smooth and even. The beadwork was inspired by the hoarfrost on winter branches. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever owned," Bethany said, meaning it sincerely. Everyone was captivated by it. "Good design shouldn't captivate," Aura corrected gently. "It should liberate. It should feel like the purest version of yourself." She looked at Bethany with discerning eyes. "Tell me about the wedding, not the venue or the guest list. Tell me how you want to feel on that day." The question caught Bethany off guard. No other designer had ever asked her that. They asked about silhouettes, necklines, fabrics. They asked about trends. Arthur had told her to talk about status, about making a statement. But this quiet, intense woman was asking about her feelings. For the next hour they talked, or rather Bethany talked. Prodded by Aura's insightful, gentle questions, she found herself speaking not just about the wedding, but about her life. She spoke of the pressure of being a Cole, the constant expectation to be perfect, to be dazzling. She admitted that sometimes the galas and the parties felt like a performance, and that she wasn't always sure who she was when the costume came off. She had never spoken this way to anyone, least of all to Arthur. The designer listened patiently, her grey eyes watchful and intelligent. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her words were perceptive, cutting through the noise to the heart of the matter. "It seems to me," Aura said finally, as the light outside began to fade, "that you are caught between wanting to be a monument and wanting to be a woman. The world expects you to be a monument. Your dress should allow you to be a woman." Bethany stared at her mesmerized. "Yes," she whispered. "That's it. That's exactly it." As she was leaving, feeling lighter and more understood than she had in years, a thought struck her. The designer's face was still naggingly familiar. "Have we met before?" Bethany asked at the door. Aura's calm expression didn't waver. "I'm not a very social person. I doubt our paths would have crossed." The answer was smooth, definitive. Bethany let it go. Back in the penthouse, Arthur was pacing like a caged tiger. His phone finally rang. It was Patrick. "You're not going to believe this," the investigator said, a note of genuine surprise in his voice. "Aura is registered as a sole proprietorship. I had to pull property deeds and utility records for the atelier address the car service dropped at. The owner of the brand, the sole designer, the woman who owns that studio, her name is Evelyn Reed." Arthur froze. The world tilted on its axis. "What did you say, Evelyn Reed? As in your ex-wife?" Arthur sank onto the sofa, the phone slipping from his numb fingers and clattering onto the marble floor. Evelyn dreary, simple, practical Evelyn. The woman he had mocked, pitied, and discarded. It was impossible. It was a joke, a mistake. But as the pieces clicked into place with horrifying speed, he knew it was true. Her hobby, her quiet nature, her strange, placid reaction at the gala. Her comment, "Practicality has its merits. It lasts." And the dress, the celeste gown, his symbol of triumph, of trading up. He had paid his ex-wife, the woman he considered a failure, a small fortune to make his new fiancée look like a queen. The humiliation was so profound, so complete, it felt like a physical blow. Just then, the door opened. Bethany swept in, her face glowing. "Arthur, it was incredible. She's a genius, an absolute genius. You should have heard the things she said. She gets it. She gets me," she gushed. Arthur looked at her, at the woman he was pinning all his hopes on, and all he could see was the ghost of his wife. He had sent Bethany into the lion's den, and she had come back calling the lion a visionary. "She's going to design the dress," Bethany announced, beaming. "And Arthur, I think it's going to be the most beautiful dress in the world." Arthur couldn't speak. He just stared, his mind a maelstrom of rage, shock, and a dawning, sickening sense of dread. The trap had been sprung, and he had walked right into it. The weeks leading up to the Metropolitan Fashion Vanguard Awards were a blur of activity for everyone involved, though for vastly different reasons. For Evelyn, it was a period of intense, focused creation. After her meeting with Bethany, she had designed a wedding dress that was, by all accounts, a masterpiece. It was not the monumental, attention-grabbing gown Bethany thought she wanted. Instead, it was a study in vulnerability and strength, made of a heavy liquid silk crepe that moved like water. It had long, clean lines, a dramatic sweeping back, and sleeves so delicately embroidered with tiny seed pearl blossoms that they seemed to have grown there. It was a dress for a woman, not an heiress. Bethany had wept when she saw the sketches. But beyond the wedding dress, bigger news was brewing. Genevieve Dubois, having championed Aura from the beginning, had used her considerable influence. Aura was to be presented with the Emerging Designer of the Year award at the upcoming Vanguard ceremony, the most prestigious event on the fashion calendar. The one condition of accepting the award was that the designer behind Aura would finally have to reveal their identity. Finn had argued for it passionately. "This is it, Ev. This is the moment. You can't stay a ghost forever. You've built the foundation. The work speaks for itself. Now it's time to claim it. It's time for Evelyn Reed to take a bow." Evelyn, after much soul-searching, agreed. It was time. Her anonymity had served its purpose. It had protected her, allowed her to build her business on merit alone. Now, stepping into the light felt less like a risk and more like a final necessary step in her own liberation. For Arthur, those same weeks were a private hell. The knowledge that Evelyn was Aura festered inside him like a poison. Every excited mention of the brand from Bethany, every gushing compliment about the mysterious designer's genius was a fresh twist of the knife. He was trapped in a farce of his own making. His fiancé was idolizing his ex-wife, and he was footing the bill. His financial situation had also worsened. The energy stock had collapsed, wiping out a significant portion of his capital. He was now more dependent than ever on his marriage to Bethany. He couldn't afford to rock the boat. He couldn't expose Evelyn without exposing his own foolishness, without destroying Bethany's happiness, and with it his own financial salvation. So he said nothing. He smiled, he nodded, he played the part of the proud, supportive fiancé, while inside he was consumed by a helpless rage. He tried to subtly poison the well. "Are you sure about the dress, darling?" he'd ask. "It seems a bit simple in the sketches." "It's not simple, Arthur, it's sublime." Bethany would counter completely under Evelyn's spell. Aura says that true elegance is quiet. The words were Evelyn's, and hearing them from Bethany's lips was a unique form of torture. The night of the Vanguard Awards arrived. It was the social apex of the season held at the Museum of Modern Art. The red carpet was a river of flashbulbs and couture. Arthur stood stiffly beside Bethany, his smile a tight, painful rictus. Bethany was a vision. She was wearing another custom Aura creation for the event, a gown of shimmering, pewter-colored silk, elegant and striking. She was once again the center of attention. "Isn't it thrilling?" she whispered to him as they took their seats in the grand auditorium. "They say Aura is going to be revealed tonight when she accepts her award. We'll finally get to see her." Arthur felt a cold sweat prickle his brow. He knew what was coming. He could have warned Bethany, could have saved her the public shock. But a dark, selfish part of him wanted her to feel the same humiliation he felt. If he was going down, he wouldn't go down alone. The ceremony began. Awards were presented. Speeches were made. Finally, Genevieve Dubois took the stage to present the award for Emerging Designer of the Year. The room fell silent. There are moments in fashion. Genevieve began, her voice resonating through the auditorium, when a new voice emerges that is so clear, so confident, and so utterly original that it changes the conversation. This year, that voice belongs to Aura. A montage of Aura's designs flashed on the giant screens. The actress at the airport, the French heiress, and finally, a stunning editorial shot of the Celeste gown. Bethany gasped and squeezed Arthur's arm. "That's my dress." Aura has reminded us, Genevieve continued, that craftsmanship is not old-fashioned, that silence can be more powerful than noise, and that a garment's true value lies not in its label, but in its soul. The designer built this brand from the ground up on her own terms, letting the work speak for itself. She is a testament to resilience, to the quiet power of artistry in a world obsessed with fame. Arthur felt his collar grow tight. Genevieve was telling Evelyn's story, his story, but from a very different perspective. "It is my profound honor to announce that the winner of the 2025 Emerging Designer of the Year award is Aura, and the incredible woman behind it, Ms. Evelyn Reed. The name hung in the air for a moment. There was a smattering of confused applause. Evelyn Reed. The name was unfamiliar to most. And then, from a side aisle, Evelyn emerged. She was wearing a simple, exquisitely cut black jumpsuit of her own design. Her hair was down, falling softly around her shoulders. She looked poised, confident, and serene. She looked nothing like the drab, defeated woman Arthur had painted in his memory. She looked like a creator, a powerhouse. The camera projecting her image onto the screens panned for reactions in the audience. It found Bethany Cole. Her jaw was slack, her eyes wide with disbelief. She looked from the screen to the stage, and then to the man beside her face a mask of confusion. And then, the camera found Arthur. His face was pale, his expression frozen in a silent scream of utter abject horror. The two shots, the shocked fiancé and the humiliated ex-husband, were broadcast for the entire fashion world to see. Bethany turned to him, her eyes flashing with a million questions. But before she could speak, Evelyn reached the podium. She looked out at the crowd, her calm, grey eyes sweeping over the room, until for a brief, searing moment, they met Arthur's. There was no triumph in her gaze, no malice. There was only a quiet finality. She leaned into the microphone. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Thank you, Genevieve and the Vanguard Committee. They say to build something new, you first have to tear down the old. I'd like to thank my ex-husband, Arthur Penhaligon. He taught me through his own actions the profound importance of self-worth. He was the one who first showed me that judging a woman by the simplicity of her clothes is a fool's game. Because you never know. She might have designed the dress your fiancé is wearing." A collective gasp went through the auditorium. It was a perfectly delivered, devastatingly elegant coup de grace. Every eye in the room swiveled from Evelyn on the stage to Arthur and Bethany. Bethany looked down at her pewter gown as if it had caught fire. The humiliation was absolute, public, and inescapable. She stared at Arthur not with confusion anymore, but with the cold, hard light of dawning comprehension and utter betrayal. Arthur didn't see her look. He was just staring at the stage, at the woman he had so casually discarded. She hadn't just built an empire from the ashes of their marriage. She had used his own arrogance as the blueprint. And she had just unveiled her masterpiece on the biggest stage in the world, leaving him buried in the rubble. The aftermath of the Vanguard Awards was a nuclear winter for Arthur Penhaligon. The story was simply too juicy to be ignored. It had everything: a scorned wife's triumphant return, a clueless heiress, and a pompous, arrogant husband receiving his public comeuppance. The gossip columns and fashion blogs feasted on it for weeks. They called it the Aura Affair and the Penhaligon Predicament. Photos of Arthur's horrified face and Bethany's shocked expression were juxtaposed with images of Evelyn's serene, powerful acceptance speech. The ride back to the penthouse was a silent, glacial affair. Bethany sat on the far side of the limousine, her arms crossed, her aura gown, looking like a cruel joke. Arthur tried to speak, to formulate a defense, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? "I'm sorry I mocked my ex-wife while secretly making you her biggest patron. I'm sorry, I'm a fool." When they arrived, Bethany didn't even look at him. She walked straight to the guest bedroom and locked the door. The next morning, her father, a formidable man, with cold, calculating eyes, arrived with two of his lawyers. The meeting was short and brutal. The engagement was off. All financial ties between the Coles and Arthur were severed. Mr. Cole made it icily clear that Arthur's name was now poison in their world. The wedding, the merger, the financial safety net, it all vanished in an instant, left alone in the sterile white penthouse that now felt like a mausoleum. Arthur's world fully collapsed. The loss of the Cole fortune meant his creditors, who had been patient in anticipation of his marriage, came calling. The leveraged bets on the energy stock became an anchor, pulling him down into a sea of debt. Within 3 months, he was forced to sell the penthouse, his car, and his collection of expensive watches. The Tom Ford suits were replaced by off-the-rack replacements. The Titan of finance was reduced to a cautionary tale whispered at the same parties he used to command. He saw Evelyn one last time months later. It was a chance encounter on a busy street. He was rushing to a job interview for a mid-level analyst position. She was stepping out of a black car, looking effortlessly chic in a camel-colored aura coat on her way into a building that probably housed her new expanded headquarters. Their eyes met across the sidewalk. He saw no pity, no gloating. He saw nothing at all. To her, he was just a man in a crowd, a ghost from a past she had long since moved beyond. That indifference was more painful than any hatred could ever be. Evelyn's world, in contrast, was dawning. Revealing her identity had been like throwing gasoline on the fire of her success. Aura, now attached to the compelling story of Evelyn Reed, became the most sought-after brand in the world. Investors lined up, but she chose her partners carefully, retaining full creative control. She opened a flagship store in Soho, a minimalist temple to her design philosophy. She accepted the commission from the European princess. Her brand became synonymous with intelligent, empowered luxury. She never spoke of Arthur publicly again. Her speech at the awards had been the first and last word on the matter. It wasn't a story she needed to tell. It was a foundation she had built upon. One evening, months after the awards, she was in her new larger studio working late. The space was beautiful, overlooking the city lights. Finn came in with 2 cups of tea, a ritual that had remained unchanged. "The final numbers for the quarter are in," he said, setting a cup on her desk. "We've exceeded our projections by 200%. "That's good," Evelyn said, smiling, but her eyes were on a sketch in front of her. "Just good," Finn teased, leaning against the desk. "Ev, we're building an empire." She looked up at him, her grey eyes clear and bright. "We're building beautiful things, Finn. That's what matters." She took a sip of her tea. "The empire is just a happy consequence." He watched her for a moment, the woman he had seen at her lowest, now so firmly at her highest. Her success wasn't a revenge story, he realized. Revenge is a hot, messy, finite emotion. This was different. This was a story of creation. She hadn't focused on destroying Arthur's world. She had been too busy building her own. His collapse was merely a side effect of her rise, a shadow cast by her growing light. Evelyn looked out the vast window at the glittering cityscape. She had once felt so small in this city, invisible beside a man who demanded all the light for himself. Now she knew the truth. The brightest light doesn't need to be demanded. It simply needs to be created. And from now on, she would be the one to create it. And so Arthur Penhaligon became a footnote in Evelyn Reed's incredible story. He learnt the hard way that a person's worth is not defined by the label on their clothes, but by the substance of their character and the strength of their spirit. Evelyn's triumph wasn't just in her success, but in her refusal to become like the man who wronged her. She found her power not in public revenge, but in the quiet, undeniable excellence of her work. Her story is a powerful reminder that the people we underestimate are often the ones with the most extraordinary things to show the world. What did you think of Evelyn's ultimate comeback? Was it a perfect act of poetic justice, or would you have wanted a more direct confrontation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing your perspectives.